Hello, my name's Ashley. Welcome to the second video in this series looking at a core of the React API. In this video, we're going to be looking at this method here, ReactDOM.render, and only that method, nothing else, starting really slow. So why are we looking at render first? Well, simply because without it, nothing happens. We have an empty app. So we really kind of have to start here. Because this is slightly different from a vanilla app, where here if I remove the JavaScript and I load the page, I still see something, there's still content, but it's just not interactive. We can still do this in a React app. If we go back to our React app, I can ensure there is something just in the HTML. And now if we load up our app, even if we're not calling React render, there was still something for the browser to show. Of course, it's still not interactive. So there's actually a whole separate API for doing this type of thing, where you have already got some HTML there before you call ReactDOM.render, and that's all to do with this ReactDOM.hydrate. But we're not going to look at that in this series. But if you're doing those types of things, this is the method you want for that. The first thing we probably notice is that render isn't part of the core React. We're getting it from this separate React DOM package. So we might be wondering, why is that? Why is it not just React.render? If I try and do that, that's not a thing. I've got to do React DOM.render. And that's because React isn't purely for building websites. And it can do a whole bunch of things to do with creating apps, or kind of creating anything. And probably the most famous example of this, a well-known example, is React Native, where we're still using React and writing things that look a lot like React and use a lot of the same concepts and even some of the same APIs we'll be covering in this series. But instead of creating a web page, React will be creating native Android or iOS apps. But again, in this series, we're going to be looking just at using React to create web pages. So this video is somewhat future-proof. It's worth pointing out that there is an experimental API from React that doesn't do ReactDOM.render, and it changes it a little bit. So again, this may change, this experimental, but kind of worth knowing that maybe in the future there won't be a ReactDOM.render. Instead, you'll have this create_root.render or something similar. A quick way to play around with this API is if you just go to kind of any of the React website and open up the JavaScript console, it's already there on the global scope. So this is what we'll do. We'll just use it directly in our browser console and have a little play. Quick side note, this is quite a common thing with other libraries. If you go to their website and open up the console, so here we have Lodash, you'll find that here I can directly play with Lodash straight in the console. Handy little tip. Okay, here on the React website, it says that this is the smallest example of using ReactDOM.render. Let's give that a go then, and we get an error. And that's because it's whizzing ahead and using JSX when we're supposed to just be using render. So let's replace that JSX with a JavaScript value we do have, null. Oh, a different error. And this is because there is no element with ID root. So let's try again and replace this with a node that we know definitely does exist, the document. And then, okay, no errors. And it's definitely done something. Let's have a look at the DOM. The DOM has vanished. So what other things can we get it to do? So let's try, instead of null, let's try some other values. Let's try false. Get the same thing. Okay, so null and false both seem to be just removing everything. What else can we try? Let's try some numbers, that's some values that we have access to. Let's try the best number ever. Okay, so that made the website disappear, but then we also got a whole bunch of errors. So So we've got here, failed to execute append child on node. Node of type text may not be inserted into nodes of type document. Okay, so, well, in fact, that's not a React error. That is just what happens if you try and if I just try and do this directly, calling the DOM API directly, I get the same error. So a few things we can learn from that is the fact that we're rendering directly into the document seems to be limiting what we can do, and also that when we're calling render, that was calling append child in much the same way that our vanilla implementation of the to-do app was calling these types of DOM APIs. If it doesn't like us rendering into directly into the document node, let's go somewhere we're probably a little bit more comfortable with and try and render into the body. That's much better. So we're now actually starting to see. So it made the React website, threw all of that away, and now we've got body with 42 inside it. So what else? We can try a null. So null makes that go away. My body's empty. What else can we try? So we can try strings. Great, so strings seem to work. I've got my body with that string inside it. What else could we try? We could try objects. I mean, objects are beautiful values. Let's try an object. Okay, we have an error. So objects are no-go for now. What about a simpler object like an array? Arrays, no error. And it's made our hello go away. So it's kind of behaving a little bit like our null did. So false made everything disappear. I wonder if that's just because false is falsy, like null is falsy. So what about true? True is also nothingness. So it's not falsy values that end up with nothing. It seems to be actual just any Boolean, all two of them result in nothing. But values like numbers and strings do seem to be actually putting things into the DOM. So the fact that arrays work means that we can try kind of groups of values. So let's try an array with 1, 2, 3, 4. So I can put things in the array. That's interesting. And the other interesting thing is it's kept those things separate. It hasn't merged all of those text nodes into one. So that's quite interesting. What else can we do? Let's, does that work with our strings as well? Yeah, so our strings also work in this. I guess the natural question is, can I put arrays inside my arrays? So let's wrap. Yes, so we can, arrays seem to work. Arrays of arrays of arrays seem to work, and I can put strings and numbers in there, and React seems to be keeping those all separate when it's updating the document. Some of you may be wondering, why is it so interesting that React kept all of our strings separate when it was updating the document? Well, it's because back in the day, before we had things like React and other more modern UI frameworks, that's not how things worked. So using something like the underscore template function, which lots of big apps were built kind of using these types of things, when you'd run their templates, it would always give you back just a full, everything combined just into one string, even though this is kind of like, a kind of separate part of the template. when you just have that string, the only thing you're really left to do with it is to just whack it directly into the DOM. You'd be using inner HTML or inner text, depending on kind of what you're expecting in the string. And that would just result in kind of one big update. Only being able to render strings and numbers and arrays, isn't particularly interesting, and it's not too good for us building our to-do app. We need more than that. So maybe we can try just rendering some HTML strings in here. So can I do this to start, doing something a bit more exciting? And yes, I can do it in terms of it doesn't error, but React hasn't treated this like HTML. It's just taken it as text and put that text directly in. And as much as this is bad news for us, because we want to start building our to-do app and we're limiting ourselves to just render, it's good news for security, because this helps prevent something called a cross-site scripting attack, or kind of XSS, where if you were rendering say you were rendering some comments that have been left on your website, and then you're rendering that for someone else, you can have some, one of those comments could say great post, and then include a whole bunch of HTML in there as well. But when we render that with React, that HTML that they've snuck into that comment is just put on, you'll just see it visually kind of in that comment. Whereas if we try to do document body, if we did treat that as HTML, then we just put that string directly in and it gets interpreted as HTML, then this will it'll create an image element with a bad source, which means the image will error, which then means the on error event will fire, and then it will run our this string here as JavaScript. So someone could leave a comment on your website that then starts running JavaScript on someone else's machine, and security problems afoot. So it's a good thing that we can't just give React HTML strings and directly render them. I mean, you can. There is an API that lets you do that, but they make sure it's very clear that it's a dangerous thing to do and it should be avoided. Let's look at what happens if we call render a few times. So let's call it with hello world, and it's changed the body to contain our two strings, hello world. And now if we run this a second time, but this time change some of that, and then if we pay attention to up here, so you can see that the DOM was updated and only the second one flashed. So if I do that again, put it back, run that, so only earth will flash. And that flashing in this GUI is representing when that part of the DOM is either created or updated. So the fact that hello isn't flashing is telling us that hello is being left alone. And in fact, if I actually run this saying hello world and it says that, then neither will flash because nothing needed to be done. So this is where we're starting to see the kind of infamous DOM diffing, of where instead of just taking what we're asking it to render and whacking that into the document, it's comparing that against what's already there and only changing the bits that have actually changed. If React is diffing against what's already there, then that should mean that if we go behind React's back and change this unbeknownst to it to say something else. So we made a change to the DOM directly that React wasn't aware that we've done. If I run the last render that we did again, we would think, oh, it's going to see that it's going to diff against the DOM and see that it needs to put this back to hello. But it doesn't. And that's because React isn't diffing against the actual DOM. It's just diffing against the last thing that we told it to render. So when I called render, it's taken this value, done its work to kind of work out what that should look like in a web page, and then kept hold of it ready for then the next time that we want to tell it to do some work. Right, so that's kind of a key thing that I think not everyone's always aware of with React. Sometimes people think that it's diffing against the real DOM, and it's not. It's diffing just against what it thinks is in the DOM, because it's it believes that it's the kind of the thing that's in charge, and really it should be the thing that's in charge of the area of the DOM you're telling it to render into, because otherwise this diffing thing kind of all breaks down. If you have some other code that's not running through React, updating bits of the DOM, and then React also is updating those same bits of the DOM, weird things happen. So once React starts rendering into part of the DOM, React should be the only thing kind of rendering and updating that area of the DOM for this kind of diffing to work. Okay, another thing that's kind of interesting is that, so let's, instead of just directly passing in that array in line, let's pull it out and assign it. So I've got my array here, and then render it. It's a bit like before, except instead of directly passing that array in, we're going to keep hold of it inside this a name. So let's render that as usual. But this time, instead of passing in like a brand new array, let's take that array and then modify it. So now our array has, so it's still the same array kind of value, except that we've changed the first item in that array from hello to now say hi. And now we give ReactDOM that same array as last time, but now with different items inside it. And when we call this, this is behaving exactly the same as if we'd given it an array that says hello world. It's React's, even though we've changed the array, React is ignoring that. And this is because kind of one of the kind of key principles in React is working with immutable data structures, and arrays aren't immutable, but React assumes you're using it as if they were. And it's kind of part of one of the kind of the key optimization tricks you can use in React is when you give React this, when it sees the same value, even if it's a mutable value like an array, React goes, oh, that's a sign that you're giving me the same thing as before. So rather than checking everything in the array, it just assumes that whole array is the same as the last time it looked at it, and it can then skip doing the whole work of checking that whole array. So if you're trying to, so we kind of can see here with render, you can't do things like give it arrays that are being mutated because React just bails out. The last thing I want to show with this is changing the number of things in the array. So we've started off with just 2, and now let's see what happens if I put something at the start of it. So we might think that React is going to do some sort of diffing algorithm where it can see that the minimal number of changes here is to just put start at the beginning and leave hello world alone. So we would expect hello and world not to flash, and then like a start to flash in at the top. But instead we can see that all of them flashed. And that's because of the algorithm that React uses for its diffing, which is known as its kind of reconciliation algorithm. And you can read up about that. The website will explain it much better than me, but a kind of a key part about it is that it's when we went from kind of just hello world to then putting something at the beginning, React is kind of default is to just see things as slots. And so previously it saw the first slot had hello and the second slot had world. And now the first slot has start. And even though the second slot has the value that used to be in the first one, it's not seeing that. What it's just seeing is that the second slot has changed from world to hello, and there's now a new slot in the third place. And this also gives us a little bit of insight about some of the things we saw earlier around the kind of empty values. So when we tried to render false and just did nothing, that's useful here for kind of actually keeping things in their right slots. So when I now do this, so this looks like just rendering hello world on its own. From a DOM perspective, that's certainly how it looks. But now hello world are in kind of the second and third slot. And now in this case, if we change this to put something in the beginning, now hello world shouldn't flash and start will just get inserted up at the top. There we go. So we can see, I definitely recommend reading the proper reconciliation docs, and we will come on to more of this because this is kind of just the default rules of lists. There are some other things we can do. Again, it's a key thing to be aware of when React's doing its diffing. One, it's not diffing against the real DOM, it's diffing against kind of its own internal state, and also it's kind of thinking about things in slots and the kind of just an order of things rather than doing kind of some sophisticated algorithm looking at everything and really trying to compute the exact minimum number of changes, because that would be much more expensive. Wow, Ashley, that took a long time and we haven't even done anything apart from put text and numbers on the screen. Yes, as I said, we're going to go through this API quite slowly. If this is too slow a pace for you, definitely, I definitely recommend, if you haven't done other tutorials, jump in, do some more faster tutorials and build some apps, and then possibly come back to this. This kind of basic thing after you've already kind of played with all these things. Maybe it'll then be interesting to come back and dive deeper. But hopefully with this video, even though we've literally just only looked at render and not even begun to look at kind of the actual majority of the code, we start to got some intuition for what render is doing. We give it something to start describing our app, and we give it a place in the document that we are saying, okay, this is the place that you can start building things into. And we were always just doing things into document.body, and whereas in our things here and in most apps, you'll see that we're doing things, you'll see the render going into normally its own element. And that's kind of part of what I said earlier about once React starts rendering into an area of the DOM, it kind of owns that area. So it tends to be kind of a polite thing to do to put a div somewhere in the body or somewhere in your app, and then let that be kind of the kind of mounting point for React to start doing its thing. Because if you do, even though it works rendering directly into the body, you kind of then left no room in the document for any other code to come along, which may be really annoying in the future. Normally we'd then try and build kind of our to-do app just using the APIs we've used so far. In this case, we can't really do that because all we've kind of done is render strings and numbers, and that's not really enough to build our little to-do app yet. We actually need some more exotic DOM nodes. We need lists and headers, and we want to add classes and things. So in the next video, we'll actually start building some kind of proper DOM. Thanks for watching. Hope you're enjoying.